All right, it's time to talk about a pretty pivotal event in American history. Women getting the right to vote. First of all, let's establish that the word suffrage refers to the right to vote. So what we're dealing with here is the women's suffrage movement. To begin with, we need to go back to 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. This was the first conference created to address women's rights in the United States. And it was here that a lady by the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton was primarily responsible for writing the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments outlined the rights that American women should be entitled to as citizens and called on women to fight for their constitutionally guaranteed right to equality. Now, unfortunately, for the suffrage movement at that time, after about 13 years, it goes on pause. Because we had this little thing called the American Civil War that dominated the focus and attention of everyone. And then that's followed by this period of Reconstruction where we've got to kind of put our country back together again. But the movement will pick up steam again later in the second half of the 1800s. I briefly mentioned the name Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she was a major player in this movement. But Susan B. Anthony is probably the most well-known activist fighting to give women the right to vote. The two of them together founded the National Women's Suffrage Association. And as the movement progressed, there were three main strategies used by suffragists to try to gain the right to vote for women. They were going to challenge it in court. That was one. Another, they were going to try to convince individual states to grant suffrage to women. And the third strategy is to get an amendment added to the Constitution. So first, let's look at how it went when they challenged it in court. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting in the presidential election. Now, she wasn't the only woman arrested for voting in that election, but her case was the most high profile. See, she wasn't trying to be sneaky and hope that she could sneak her vote by the authorities or anything like that. She did it with the intention of getting arrested. So the constitutionality of not allowing females to vote could be challenged in court. They were challenging it based on the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868, right after the end of the Civil War, and it stated that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge, meaning restrict, the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. The amendment was designed to protect the rights of America's black citizens following the Civil War. But in the wording, it did not differentiate between men and women. So the suffragists were arguing that they were citizens and their rights were being restricted by not being able to vote. Ultimately, the courts decided that, yes, women are citizens, but that wasn't the purpose of the amendment, and it didn't apply to this situation. In the end, Susan B. Anthony is found guilty and punished with a $100 fine, a fine that she will never pay. The second strategy I mentioned was trying to get individual states to give voting rights to women. This one did have some success, primarily in the new Western states. There's differing theories as to why the Western states seemed to get on board with this idea first. Maybe it was a lack of organized opposition. Maybe it was a way to entice more women to come out west. But whatever the reasons in the individual states, Wyoming was the first to grant women's suffrage in 1869. Now, they were only a territory at the time and wouldn't become a state until 1890. But I'm not going to worry about differentiating between what was a territory and what was a state at the time. So Wyoming was followed by Utah and Washington and Montana and Colorado, Idaho, California, Arizona, Kansas, Oregon, and others. In total, 15 states would give women the right to vote before it became part of the Constitution. Michigan was actually one of those states. Michigan gave women the right to vote 2 years before it became a constitutional amendment and a right throughout the nation. Ultimately, though, it was going to take that amendment to the Constitution to secure the right to vote for all females. What will eventually become the 19th Amendment is first introduced to Congress in 1878. It would be reintroduced and defeated every year for the next 40 years until it's finally passed in 1919 and goes into effect in 1920. So the question is, what changed? What changed to make this possible? Because in order for something to be added to the Constitution, it has to have a lot of support. Now, we're not going to go into the different ways that an amendment can be added to the Constitution, but it's not easy. It has to have pretty good support in order to be put out, in order to be added on as part of our Constitution. So let's back up. Now, in 1900, just under 1 in 5 women worked. And those that did work only received about half the pay as men. That was generally accepted because women workers were thought of as being single and only needing to support themselves. Now, that doesn't mean they all were, but that's how they were perceived. And if they were married, well, then it was thought they didn't need to make as much money because the husband was supporting the family anyways. But this is going to start to change a little bit. One of the things we talked about in the last unit was that industrialization made education more available for many people who had previously been isolated in rural areas and had their time dominated by farm work. Well, with the increased availability of education, by 1890, female high school graduates outnumbered male graduates. And it makes sense that as those education levels rose, more and more women began going on to college. At that time, many of the colleges denied admission to females, and so we started to see the creation of sister schools. For example, right across the street from Notre Dame is St. Mary's College, which is an all-girls school and was founded at a time when girls were not allowed into Notre Dame. St. Mary's remains a women's college today. There was some talk of merging St. Mary's and Notre Dame when Notre Dame began accepting women, which in the big scheme of things was actually surprisingly recent. But St. Mary's chose to remain their own independent college. So as we start to see female colleges emerge, and when you think about getting a college education, you know that it costs money. So as more and more women are going on to college and paying tuition to do so, more and more are going to want to do something with that education when they get done with school. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not like we're seeing a massive flood of women into the workforce at this time in the nation's history. That's not going to come until much later. But there was a trickle. And women overall were becoming more and more educated and more involved in daily life outside the home. The final push really came during World War I, when large numbers of women were recruited to work in jobs that had been vacated by men who went to fight in the war. And this led to women working in areas that were formerly dominated by men. So long story short, when the war's over, you take into account the contribution American women made on the home front to keep the country functioning and thriving, along with the higher levels of education, and it just no longer made sense. Not that it ever really made sense, but especially now, it no longer made sense to tell American women, that they were making such huge contributions to our nation, they still had no say in the politics of our nation. And so we get the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1919, which then goes into effect in 1920. It's also important to note that this was not just an American movement. It was happening at the same time in European countries, New Zealand, and Australia. I mean, you can see on the different dates behind me on the map that show when women received the right to vote in these different countries. And there was communication between suffrage activists in the United States and other nations, especially Britain. They communicated and even traveled back and forth to discuss the issue until ultimately women are given the same political rights as men.